As we say in French, les absents ont toujours tort. The absentees are always wrong. I am glad to introduce this afternoon our last invited keynote speaker, Gerhard Ermischer, or Ermischer, as should be said. Gerhard was a long time ago. Gerhard was born in Salzburg, in Austria. He studied history and archaeology in Innsbruck and in the United Kingdom at the University of Southampton. This is why he will speak in a very fluent English today. He obtained his PhD, his doctoral degree in 1993, and has been working as an archaeologist and museum curator in Aschaffenburg, a lovely small town in Germany, since 1991. There he established an association dedicated to the cultural landscape of the Spessart-Region, of which you'll hear more. And that association was established in 1998. It is called the SpessartProjekt. This association, and this is also this involvement of Gerhard in this association is one of the reasons why we invited him here as keynote speaker, was based on the participatory contribution of some 7,000 volunteer citizens which engaged in research, interpretation and management activities in the Spessart landscape together with Gerhard and the team of the SpessartProjekt. Nowadays, the SpessartProjekt is an acknowledged research institute at the University of Würzburg. So I would say that the underlying theme here is citizen science. This early experience of citizen science brought him to collaborate with the Council of Europe on the European Landscape Convention since 2001. Gerhard is also one of the founding members of CIVILSCAPE, which is a partner in Modscapes, and whose director, Dirk Gottsman, you'll hear right after that. And in this capacity, he represents CIVILSCAPE at the Council of Europe's Conference of INGOs, the International Non-Governmental Organization. Gerhard, the floor is yours.
Yeah, thank you so much. Well, I've asked to become more mobile because I don't have a paper to read from, so I thought I could be a little bit more proactive as I have this wonderful big stage and don't need to stand behind the pulpit all the time. So the title of that paper is The Hidden Landscape, and The Hidden Landscape, a case study from the Spessart. When we talk about modernist landscape, planned and planted settlements, why do I speak about a hidden landscape when I speak about the Spessart? For that, maybe I have to give you a few words as an introduction to the Spessart area, because as much as it pains me, I have to confess I cannot expect everybody in this room to know exactly where it is and what it is. So the Spessart area is situated quite central in Germany. You see this red polyangle, and it's on the border of two of the German federal states, Bavaria and Hesse, and it's an upland region which is mainly forested and which is split into a number of administrative units, which makes it very complicated to administrate and to talk about as a unit. But especially it has an enormously strong branded image. And that is the image of that it is basically a woodland, not really a forest, but seen as a wilderness, that it is dominated by poverty and by the famous Spessart highwaymen or Spessart robbers. So what you see on your left side, that is an image from the early 20th century from a painter from Aschaffenburg who, for the newly founded hiking association, was making posters to advertise the Spessart as a hiking region. And you see the iconic water castle of Mesperbrunn, which at that time already was the center and focus of tourism. You see the Spessart oaks, which are seen as the iconic tree of that forested area, and you see the wild boar, which is the major venison. And on the other side, you see the poster of a movie from the 1950s, the Spessart Inn. Well, times have moved on. 20 years ago, when I said that in Estonia or any other of the Eastern countries, everybody would know it. Now the public has become a little bit younger, and you haven't. But this was actually still today the economically most successful movie ever made in Germany. And it's about a novel about a robber baron and his adventures in the Spessart. Now, this image is not really true. The Spessart has an abundance of heritage, starting from the prehistoric period and from the medieval period, from the 12th, 13th century on. It was practically a medieval industrial landscape. The huge glass windows in the Cathedral of Cologne were produced in the Spessart. And not just the glass windows in the Cathedral of Cologne, but in many of the great churches along the River Rhine up to Uppsala and Lund have been produced completely or partly in the Spessart. And only for the big glass windows which were put into the cathedral in Cologne in 1280, it was such an amount of wood was needed as today would grow in the modern Spessart within 20 years. And Spessart means an area of 40 kilometers west to east, 60 kilometers north to south, roughly 2,400 square kilometers, mainly forested area. So you can imagine the amount of wood which was just used for that one big production slot. Glasses were produced in the 15th, 16th, 17th century in the Spessart. The greatest part of it, the bulk, was brought immediately to the Netherlands, first to Antwerp, later to Amsterdam, and sold on the international market, which actually bound the Spessart into a network of what you today might call global economy. And the Spessart teamsters were actually the lorry drivers of the 15th, 16th, 17th century, transporting goods for the great merchant families like the Fuggers and Welsers in Germany, from Venice to Antwerp, to Cologne, up to Novgorod and Moscow. So that was really a thriving area for a long time, but with the industrialization, as most of the upland regions in Europe, it lost out and it became a region of poverty. And that image of poverty brands the region until today. So one of the sources, of course, for that thriving economy in the medieval time, early modern times, was the wood, which was the main source for energy. That's why the Hanseatic states financed the crusade to conquer the Baltic countries, because they wanted to get their hands on the abundance of wood which existed here. And it was, of course, also building material, especially the famous Spessart oaks, which were transported, for example, to Amsterdam to supply the pilots on which most of Amsterdam was built. So if you go into the Cathedral of Cologne today, you can look through the Spessart forest of the 12th and 13th century. If you walk through the streets of Amsterdam, you walk on the Spessart forest of the 15th, 16th century. It was a global place, but today it's not perceived as that. You had an abundance of small brooks and rivers, constant supply of flowing water throughout the year, and that, of course, was the driving force for the mills, which was the industry until the 19th century, until the industrialization. So you had a lot of things going on there, but as I said, for the last 150 years, the image was just poverty, forest, and nothing happening really in this area. So nobody would expect you had something like planned and planted settlements in the Spessart. So I start with an early example, and one from 1765, a settlement in Moosborn, which was planted by the Dukes of Hesse, who owned that territory at the time. What you see here, it's a planned settlement with model farms. 8 of these model farms were realized on, as usual, a symmetric grid. And the question is, why did they do that in 1765? Well, this was in the period of the Small Ice Age. And we are talking about an upland region. So the climate was cold and wet. And the Spessart is basically a sandstone plateau. So that is not a really good soil for farming. So basic reason for that was meliorization of land. You wanted to bring in farmers to improve the land. But the real reason behind that was that the Duke of Hesse of the time, Frederick II of Hesse, he was quite famous for selling his own subjects to other potentates in Europe as soldiers. So he press-ganged the young men into the Hessian army, had them trained, and then sold them especially to the King of England. The Hessian soldiers became famous or infamous in the American War of Independence. The cry of the Americans was, God help us, the Hessians are coming. Well, imagine, you get press-ganged, put in the army, sold to the English king, shipped over the ocean to fight in a war you don't understand in a country which just frightens you. You will not be a very nice opponent to have. So the reason for this settlement plots by the Hessian Duke was simply to harvest soldiers. Yeah, they should breed and breed soldiers, which he could then again sell to subsidize his extremely luxurious lifestyle. Friedrich Schiller in Kabale and Liebe was actually talking about that sort of slave trade done by some of the German dukes in the time. Now another example more to the modernist theme of this conference, and that is the settlement of the Strietwald in Aschaffenburg. And the Strietwald settlement is extremely interesting because this was a settlement which was planned in the early 30s as a reaction of the big financial crisis 1929 and the global economic crisis after that. And you had all these unemployment, people starving, and social problems. And of course, that helped to rise the Nazi Party in Germany, for example. And if you look at most of the historians, they will tell you that the Weimar Republic, the democracy, was not really coping with that problem. And that is not true, because in the 1930s, early 1930s, they started to set up an enormous plan for rehousing. And what they wanted to do is they wanted to have people help build their own houses on plots of undeveloped land in a structured settlement structure, and on that, on one hand, earning some money, and on the other hand, getting housed again, getting a roof over their heads. In Aschaffenburg, that strategy was implemented by the city council and the mayor of the time, Mr. Matt, who was from the Labour Party. And they actually had finalized all the plans in the end of 1932. So they were ready to start in spring of 1933. What happened is, in January 1933, at the elections, Mr. Hitler was made the new Reichskanzler in Germany. And within a couple of weeks, the Nazis took the power in Germany in a sort of inner coup d'etat. And they occupied all the plans which were there. So on the 28th of March, it was the Nazi Party to inaugurate the building of the new settlement in Strietwald. And it did such a brilliant job in that they brought the Gauleiter, the chief of the Nazi Party of Lower Franconia, to Aschaffenburg for a big ceremony. And from that time on, everybody believed that it was a Nazi planning. If you go to Wikipedia today, you can find an article about Strietwald. It will tell you that it was a typical Nazi-planned settlement. And they will not wonder how it could be possible, even for the Nazis, to have the cornerstone of the foundation laid on the 28th of March, 1933, when they just had come in power at the end of January 1933. Even the Nazis couldn't do that within 4 weeks. Yeah? It's simply not possible. No, what they did, they actually occupied the plan. But the plan fit very, very well into their own ideology. It was thought to be a settlement for working class people. So the Nazis said, okay, wonderful, we are the people for the working class, yeah, that we are a revolutionary party. It was a different layouts for the houses, so there should be single houses, double houses, and terraced houses. The Nazis decided only to build the single houses, because the single houses had a plot of land around them, not to have a nice garden, but to have a nice little farm, where you could grow your vegetables and have a few hens and even maybe a goat, so that you would be self-sufficient. The idea behind that with the old government was, from the experiences of the world economic crisis and all the starvation you had in Germany, that it would be a good idea if people had at least a plot of land which they could rely on in a crisis. For the Nazis, it fit very well into their ideology, because they wanted every new German to become a farmer, who would toil the soil with their own hands and then produce their own products on their own land. So that was fitting very well. So what happened was they really occupied the whole plan. And when the first houses were finalized, they had again a big ceremony, and there was a report in the newspaper. And what you see here on that house is there are not only these girlands, but there are actually a lot of Nazi flags with the swastika put on that house. A little bit difficult to see on that grainy photograph. Therefore, Therefore, you have all these red things popping up now. Every red frame is marking one of the flags. So wherever they could put a little flag, they put a little flag to show who actually was responsible for that building activity. And the guy you see up here, that was Dr. Helmut. He was the Gauleiter of Lower Franconia, really an in-the-wool dyed Nazi who has been Gauleiter since 1926 or something like that. So he was really one of the Nazis of the very first hour. What you also see on this building, you see here, the basement looks different as the rest. And we have a small picture coming up here. That's how you can see it still today on the houses. One of the ideas was that people would not only help to build their houses, but you should use local materials. Something we also have here several times already during the last 2 days. And one of the local materials they had here in Striedwald was that there was a volcano, the one only we have in the Spessart. And in this volcanic chimney, there was basalt, which was quarried in the late 19th century, and then they decided to use that quarry to make the basement of the houses. The basalt is a very, very hard stone, but you cannot shape that into nice blocks. And this is an area where you have sandstone, so we are used to very nice cubic blocks to build houses. But what you can do with it, because it is hard, because it is very weather resistant, you can build nice basements from that. And some of the people who actually lived in these houses, built these houses, also worked in the quarry. So they actually broke the stone from which they built their own houses. So when together with the people in Striedwald, we created a thematic trail, a cultural path, the very first in Aschaffenburg, one of the things they really wanted to do was to make that quarry accessible again, because it had been completely overgrown, you couldn't see it anymore, you couldn't access it. And that's not because it was such an interesting geological feature, but that was the place where they or their fathers and grandfathers had actually got the stone to build the houses they lived in. That also shows you that there is a very specific identity to this settlement. The building activities, of course, had to start with the beginning of the war and the war economy, but quite recently, after the end of the Second World War, it was commenced again because there were so many people with no roofs over their heads. Aschaffenburg had been bombed very heavily in the war. Then all the refugees arrived, so you were desperately needing new housing. So they just continued on the plans which they already had. And with the same concept that people would contribute by building as much as possible of their own houses. And the settlement grew. And then later, of course, with the economic miracle, people became more individualistic and wanted to have their own plan of a house. So then it, of course, diverted from the original scheme. But in 1957, in the school in Striedwald, they had the pupils write about their experience of living in the Striedwald settlement. And one of the people who actually, as a volunteer, worked on that thematic trail, he had preserved his sheet, which he had done as a child in 1957. And that is really a fascinating piece of document, and therefore I've translated that. It starts with the headline, "It is beautiful in the Strietwald settlement." And then he writes, about 20 years ago, 50 working class families erected small settlement houses in the northwest of Damm. Now, Damm was the city quarter of Aschaffenburg, actually an old medieval village with a very interesting history, which was incorporated into Aschaffenburg 1910. And it's, of course, an interesting statement. About 20 years ago, 50 families started. There is no mentioning of Nazi planning. There is also no mentioning of any planning before that. But it's like if the families were just coming together and deciding, we want to have a settlement. Yeah? So that's what, of course, in the schools happened at the time. You didn't want to talk about the Nazi period anymore. The fact that it actually was a planning from the Weimar Republic was more or less forgotten. So you rationalized in the way that people themselves had decided to build a settlement. In the following years, many more houses were added. Well, actually, there were 40 families in 1933, and then until the war, it was about 50 houses which had been completed. So over time, a whole settlement community has evolved, which now counts about 950 souls. So that's, of course, with the development after the Second World War until 1957. A few years ago, the settlers got a new school and a modern church. The settlers live free and happy. They love the German word Heimat, which is really not translatable, but I translate it as good as it possible into English, their home. Now, this is an interesting statement again, because it states in the beginning that it was for working class people. And the people in Strietwald were very proud of that. But it also set them apart from the people in Damm, the city quarter, which they were attached to as a settlement. Because Damm, with its old history, it's basically a middle-class settlement area. So between the two parts, the old quarter of Damm and the new settlement of Strietwald, there were really no communications whatsoever. And people told me when they were children in the 50s, 60s, 70s, that the parents in Damm would tell their children not to play with those kids from the settlement because they would catch all the, diseases, fleas, lice, stupid ideas, might become thieves or have early sex, whatever, drink alcohol and smoke. So don't play with those kids because it's dangerous. Huh? So that was very, very close settlement. And the other thing which is quite striking is this mention of the modern church. The church was extremely important. Interesting enough, the very first settlers in 1933 already wanted to have a church. And one lady who owned a huge field in this area dedicated that in 1935 to the Church Foundation of St. Michael in Aschaffenburg with the specific request that a church should be built on that plot. But then the Nazis wanted that to be one of their model settlements. And a Nazi model settlement doesn't have a church. So the city refused to give a permission to build the church. The settlers tried again and again in different places to build churches. The government in Aschaffenburg always said no, and then they brought in a building from the National Socialistic Health Service. They built a kindergarten to keep them quiet and also to influence the kids, of course. So all schemes to prevent a church to be built in that settlement. So immediately after the war, of course, there were other problems than just to build a church. But in 1953, the church was finally finished. And it was extremely important because in the moment you have a church, it's a village. It's no longer just a settlement or something which is part of a city quarter, but it is its own village. Yeah? And we will see that in other cases how important it was for the people in that time to have the church. That really, for them, put the seal on the fact, this is our settlement, now we have arrived here, this is forever, this is our home. So this is the church which was finished in 1953. So another settlement that I just wanted to show you. We have heard in one lecture yesterday about Estonia being the landscape of the ruins. And that from one point you could see the ruins of 3 development phases in the 20th century. We have one settlement in the north of the Spessart, Letgenbrunn, which, well, actually is the same for different reasons. It was destroyed in the 30 Years' War. It was rebuilt again, and then became quite a normal village. And in 1902, you see one of these postcards. And it's an interesting thing, because if you look at that in this time, end of the 19th century, beginning of the 20th century, sometimes you think every cowshed in the country had its own postcard. So Letgenbrunn had its own postcard. But 10 years later, the Prussian army decided that they would make a huge training area in the North Spessart, and that Letgenbrunn would become the training field for the Prussian army to learn how to fight in settled areas. So the people of Letgenbrunn were forcibly resettled, and Letgenbrunn became that playground of the army where they learned and trained how to fight in a settlement area. It caused a lot of damage to the settlement, but it didn't last very long, because 1918, the First World War had ended, and with the Treaty of Versailles, Germany only could have a very, very tiny little army, and they didn't need this huge training area in the north of Spessart anymore. So Letgenbrunn was given back to the people, and they decided they would rebuild it. That was not a very good decision, because in 1933, the Nazis came to power and immediately said, we want to rebuild the strong army, and for that we need training grounds. And we have this wonderful training ground in the north of Spessart, which worked very well for Hindenburg, so it will work for us as well. And Letgenbrunn was used as a training ground. That wasn't a bad idea either, so they decided to do the same again. So after about 20 years, the settlers were displaced again, and Letgenbrunn became again a training field for the army. And during the war, it was used for the Luftwaffe, for the Air Force, to train their bomber pilots. So they were throwing the bombs in. So after that, the whole village was completely destroyed. So you see the Nazi officers here. It's not after an Allied airstrike where they stand in the ruins, but it was their own pilots who were training, who had gratefully achieved to hit the buildings and destroy them. Okay. So, end of the Second World War, and it was given back to the civil society again. So what happened there is that immediately they used that area because there was water supply, there was some basic infrastructure as a refugee camp, and set up those typical round houses which then were built on a standard issue for the refugees. And already in 1947, it was decided, that was immediately after the state of Hesse was founded, that there wasn't a German state at the time, but first the Allied forces re-established or reinvented the German states. So after the state of Hesse had been founded, they immediately decided that they would build one of their big refugee settlements. With some money that the Hessian state could have, they started to build. And it was exactly the same as before. So the people had to help build their own houses. Materials were mainly taken at that time from the rubble and gravel of the destroyed village, because there was no other building material at hand. It had to be recycled. And they started to build a settlement. And still in the 50s, it was like that you had one spring, one fountain in the middle of the settlement, and the people had to go there to get their water. And there were people from all different parts of Germany, but also from other parts of the world where German minorities had been expelled, who settled there. And that you can see still today in the name of the streets. Sudetenstraße, South Moravian Way, Karlsbad Street, Dresden Street, Stettin Street. So all the places where the settlers came from were put on the street names. And again, what was extremely important was to have the church. So already in 1954, the church was finalized. But because the displaced people, the refugees, came from different parts of the former Germany and neighboring states, this was not a homogeneous group. So there were Catholics as well as Protestants. And that was, of course, always causing an enormous problem. Today, they tell you always that the refugees were integrated immediately into German society. It was all without any fuss and problem. That's not true. And especially the problems between Catholic and Protestants were enormous. If Protestants came to Catholic areas, Catholics came to Protestant areas, it caused enormous problems. So here they had to live together as refugees in their own settlement. So they decided, together with the two churches, to build one church for both confessions, which had, in the middle of the church, there was the tower, and you had the two rooms for the Protestants and for the Catholics, and then the common rooms for both of them in the same church. To make a statement that this was now our settlement, and we would work together to make it happen. And again, when this church was finalized, that was really the point where the village came off. Most interesting on that, that church was mainly built on money collected from different sources, some money which was given by the state of Hesse, and the single most greatest donation came from the American soldiers of the neighboring base in Gelnhausen. So the American soldiers collected between themselves to help contribute to that church and came up with the biggest single contribution to that church. I always think that is quite an interesting feature as well. So Rotenbergen, that's another case of military architecture which was then reused. But that was a little different story. So Rotenbergen, that was really already a tourist village in the end of the 19th century, which you can see on that postcard. Was already a tourist village, and it was very cute, and it was typical with timber frame buildings and all you expect in that part of Germany. And then the Nazis came and said, we want to have our Luftwaffe again, but we are not allowed to have an air force because of the Treaty of Versailles. So we have to do it clandestine. So if we build an airfield, we have to somehow camouflage the military buildings. And they decided to do it here in Rotenbergen, and because it was this nice, cute village, to camouflage all the military buildings as timber frame buildings with a nice facade, which was just a second village beside the original one. Yeah? So what you see here, this is the original village, and this pink area was the airfield, and you can see that on this aerial photography. This is the original settlement. This is all the buildings for the airfield, which were camouflaged as a village, and the rest is actually what you need as an airfield with running fields and things like that. And this is a model of that airfield. So what they did, you see here the timber frame buildings just on top of the bunkers and other military features. This is the kitchen shed, which was built on top of the entrance to the main bunker, and the kitchen staff is posing for a photo. It was used as an air base in the beginning of the war. Then it became a training base. It was bombed at the end of the war. Well, what actually was hit most was not the airfield, but the real village, the original village. And then when the Americans occupied it, they used it more or less as a junkyard for military stuff which was out of use. And after a very short period, gave it back to the civilian authorities, who then again decided, okay, we have quite some buildings here, we have the infrastructure here, we build a settlement for the refugees. And settlement was built on standardized houses, and they were able, in the early 50s, to attract a big company to build an industrial plant there, and then that was integrated in the settlement scheme. So in the end, it looked like that. You had this industrial plant here, and the settlement like an L around the industrial plant where the people would find work and employment. And that plant was working well until the 80s, and then it went bankrupt and it was supplanted by something else. And today there is an innovation center there in this area. The settlement basically, all the houses with the red roofs are the original ones from the late 40s, early 50s, and the other ones here with the gray and brown were then added later in the 60s and 70s. In Ringheim, close to Aschaffenburg, was a very similar case. There it was a huge field which was owned by the market town of Groß-Ostheim, and they built one of their airfields for the Luftwaffe. In that case, there was no cute little village which you could use as a disguise, so they just tried to disguise it on the maps. The whole project was called under a code name, the Sheep Meadow, and on the maps of the time, it was marked as a sheep meadow. So yesterday we heard about the lying maps of Soviet Estonia. Of course, that was done in that period in Germany just as well. What you see here is the aerial photographies from 1945, and then what happened 62 and how it looks today. This was an airfield which was used in the first campaigns of the Second World War, especially in the campaign against France. The air raids against Froh, which had a lot of military structures, were run from that airfield. Later on, it was given to the Research Institute of the Luftwaffe. So that was a really important point because here they tested new machines, new turbines, new weapons, new bombs and things like that. So it was quite important enough that at the end of the Second World War, when this area was taken by the Americans under General Patton, Patton himself came to visit that field of the Luftwaffe Research Institute to see what they had captured there. When they built it, and that's another interesting feature, they did some archaeological excavations and they found some prehistoric grave hills. And I will tell you later why that is important for the later settlement. But when they actually started to build, they made a postcard of that. But of course, it couldn't say, we built now an airbase, but it said, it is a postcard for the new development in the market town of Groß-Ostheim. You see a guy here in the Franconian clothes, in the Bavarian, which is quite funny. You have this sort of May tree, which you also use when you plant a new settlement or a building activity. And of course, because it was called the Sheep Meadow, you have lots and lots of sheep here with the shepherd and his carriage. And in the background, you see the machine already working. So a lot of the buildings stood after the Second World War, like the casino for the officers. This was actually the huge shed for the Research Institute of the Luftwaffe. They dismantled the shed immediately after the war. A lot of metal structures were in that which could be used for rebuilding other structures. But the smaller one in front of it was used as one of the first houses, and it still exists today. You see, they brought in again the refugees and displaced people. This was a part of the air control, which later was transformed into a school, and now is simple houses. And you can see here again an area photography, how it looks today. And you see the settlement which has developed on the actual airfield, and industrial plants which are here. There is a small part which is still now an airfield, again. And the red circle in the middle, that is where now is the church. And that was, again, people wanted to have their church there. It took quite a long time until it was finalized in the 60s. And they were really proud when the church was finalized in the 60s. And that was the point when they said, okay, now this is our settlement. It also needs a name. It didn't have a name until that. So decided to call it Ringheim because there are documents that in the medieval period in this area there was a village which has been destroyed or given up in the end of the medieval period, which was called Ringheim. What you see here are the first settlement houses along the road. And that is one of the bomb craters because that airfield was bombed at the end of the Second World War in front of the church, which now is somehow made into a feature, I don't know, feature of art or feature of recreation, but it's integrated into the whole structure because it's part of the history. The history, of course, is still there in the forest. A lot of the old structures of bunkers and of military things like bomb craters, artillery, anti-aircraft artillery stands and so forth are still there. One of the bunkers has been restored. It's now the building where the local history society resides, where they make small exhibitions, where they give lectures. And one of the things which became very important for us to understand is people want to have a history. Now, they came as refugees from different parts into that former airfield, had to build their own settlement, but still they want to have that this settlement has some sort of history. So there were the archaeological finds from the period when the airfield was built, so that gave them some sort of prehistoric background. There was the story about the medieval village of Ringheim, from which they took the name. And there is, of course, the story of the airfield, of the bunkers, and what is still preserved. And also that has nothing to do with them personally, because they all came here after the end of the airfield as refugees. It is important for them to preserve that and to show that and to communicate that. And yeah, what you saw on the screen, now it's also, again, a small airfield there, and they're very proud of that, so they had to set up a monument that this is now, again, a small airfield. Civilian one, of course. But then, of course, there's also the story about the air raid on Fro in the campaign against France. And Ringheim and Fro, at a very, very early stage, they formed a jumelage. And there is a monument in Fro with one of these propellers of one of the German aircrafts, remembering the airstrike. But when we created the cultural path, the thematic trail there, in the communication between the people in Ringheim and Fro, they decided that they would cast a peace bell and would put that on a metal structure along the path, and that for special occasions that bell could be rung. And there were these pictures of the very, very first emergency church, which they built in a shed in 1947. Where they had built this wooden structure so they could hang up a small bell so that the church would have a belfry and a bell. So they decided that they would take this structure from 1947, reconstruct that in steel, and have the peace bell hang on that structure to commemorate also the story of their own settlement. What is again interesting is the very, very strong identity of the people in the settlement. Now, Großostheim today is a market town which consists of 4 pieces, 4 parts, because with the reforms, administrative reforms of the 60s and 70s, they brought in 2 medieval villages, Pflaumheim and Wenig Umstadt, and then you had Ringheim, which also was administratively a part of Großostheim, but completely set apart as a settlement. So when people from there came and said, oh, we want to have a thematic trail, one of those cultural passes. We went to the mayor and said, okay, how shall we do it? And the mayor immediately said, okay, we have to be very careful. We have to be very diplomatic. So what we do is, we make one cultural pass in Ringheim, and that will be the first one. And then we make one in Wenig Umstadt and one in Pflaumheim. That will be the second and third one. And then we make 2 in the original market town of Großostheim. So they will get their pass as the last, but instead of 1, they will get 2. And everybody will be happy. And then they decided in the working group, yes, but we do not want to be called Großostheim. So they decided to use a medieval name for the region, which was Bachgau, as an umbrella for the whole project. So we got 5 of the cultural passes under the label of Bachgau. And then 2 of them are called Bachgau 4 and 5, Großostheim. And the others take the names of the other parts. And this really shows how strong this identity is. And these people in the settlements, they have as strong as an identity of their settlement as the people in these old medieval villages in Pflaumheim and Wenig Umstadt. And it's as important for them to be seen as something special, yeah, with their own identity. Now, let's go a little bit ahead. After the economic miracle, into the 60s, and that is close to Aschaffenburg again. It's in Meinerschaft. It's a small village just in front of Aschaffenburg. And it became important when the motorway was built in the 50s, connecting Nuremberg to Frankfurt, so 2 of the big economic centers of Germany, and Aschaffenburg is just lying on the way. And it's going right through the Spessart, which changed the social structure of the Spessart completely, because now it was possible for the people in the Spessart to drive within half an hour to Frankfurt, Offenbach, Hanau, into the industrial center, and have really good, well-paid jobs there. But it was also possible for the people from those centers to drive outside and have now their apartments or houses not in Hanau and Offenbach, where all the industry was, and the smog, and the dirt, and the dust, and the noise, and the smell, but to have it in a nicer, greener environment. So, what happened was this. To build the motorway, you need a lot of gravel. And in Minerschaft, there was gravel abundance, and they made a quarry to take out the gravel for the motorway. When the motorway was finished, the quarry was closed. And you can see it here. It's absolutely close to the river mine. So what happened is that within a very short period, the whole pit was filled with water. And the people from Minerschaft went there to have a nice swim. So then it was decided, okay, when we have that situation, and we have all these people who do not really want to live in Offenburg and Hanau, we could offer them apartments in Minerschaft. And they built 6 high-rise buildings, 16 floors high. That were the first high-rise buildings in the region. They were not built in the city of Aschaffenburg. They were built in the small village of Minerschaft. They still dominate the skyline of the whole area until today. A 7th building was, because it was very successful, a 7th building was built here, later in the 70s, which is 23 floors high. So, and then it was built just along the shore of this artificial lake. And it was advertised to the people in the industrial center, especially middle-class people, engineers, middle management people. That was the target group. I was advertised like that. The idyll of Adria in the front of Aschaffenburg, and it said later on in this article, this is not Milano Marittima. No, it is Minerschaft. And the lake in Minerschaft with the new built high-rise buildings, and it's the wonderful place to live there. And actually it worked. People wanted to live there. So the houses were filled within a short time. As I said later, they built even a 7th one even higher as the others. It completely changed the social structure of that village. I mean, if you look back on that prospect, you can see the village here. It's a typical village. There is a little industry here, and then you have these enormous high-rise buildings, very urban structures. So it completely changed the social structure of the village. In the beginning, of course, that were 2 worlds, which had absolutely no contact with each other, but that changed through the time. People from Minerschaft also bought apartments or rented apartments in that part. And when we had made a cultural trail there, and we asked the people, what are the stories you want to tell? They said, we want to tell about the building of the motorway and about the building of the high-rise buildings, because that changed our life more than anything else. And then other people said, yeah, but who would want to know about that? I can tell you that this is one of the most successful cultural passes we have. People from the village and from the high-rise buildings are now working as volunteer guides, guiding people along this cultural path, telling the stories and how their life changed with the motorway and with the high-rise buildings and all the stories around that. And people find that highly fascinating and love it. So you can see that is the skyline still today, very dominant. And the last thing is another development just of the same time, and it's the so-called Waldstadt in Klein-Ostheim, translates as the forest city. And that was a project like sort of garden city in the 1960s, again, because that was really in the green, in the forest. And it was planned, as you can see here, quite as a massive settlement structure, starting with chalets, and then later on bigger buildings should be added to it. And the chalets and bungalows were sought for an even better paid class of customers than for the high-rise buildings in Minerschaft, because it was done together with Lufthansa and the airport in Frankfurt. And it was sought for airplane captains, pilots in the towers of Frankfurt Airport, technicians and engineers of Lufthansa service, and middle management of the Lufthansa and Frankfurt Airport. So that was a target group for that. And the idea again was, of course, it's all built on three different types of bungalows with a little garden around them, integrated into this forested area. It never became as big as it was planned, so this is what it actually did. And then, of course, there was a problem with the people in Klein Ostheim, with the market town next to it. And they said, well, this is all for the people in Frankfurt. What with us? So then the council of Klein Ostheim and the mayor renegotiated with the company, and they decided to give back a plot of land to the town, and they would create a series of terraced houses for the local people. These terraced houses were not as posh as the bungalows, but still, for the time, had very, 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 very good standard. But they also served another purpose, because what you see here is the railway line. So these houses, they actually shield the bungalows from the noise of the railway. Okay, so that's what happened. This is the railway. This is one of the houses bought by one of the pilots of Lufthansa. And the way they sold it to the people in Frankfurt and the employees of the airport and Lufthansa was, okay, here you see the settlement itself, as it is today, was this. Live 10 years longer in the healthy air of the Spessart. Because then Frankfurt and Frankfurt Airport had really a lot of air pollution. And so they said to the people, if you go there, if you live there, in the green, in the nice fresh air, you will live 10 years longer. And we have asked our doctors, it's proven medically, this is what you can expect. So that was the way it was sold to the potential client. And because, of course, in that time, these people, they had already cars. There was no problem for them because they could reach Frankfurt within 20 minutes. What they thought in the beginning was that they would build a supermarket or shopping mall and some other facilities. They never came into being because this upper middle class, higher class families, even the wives had cars and had driving licenses, which normal families in that time, women didn't have driving licenses in Germany, but they had. So they were going shopping in Frankfurt and doing all the other stuff in the city. It was only for sleeping that they came back here into this settlement. It still exists today, it's still quite successful, but it never became just as big as they thought it would. So that was the last example I wanted to give you, and yeah, that's it. Nearly in time. Yeah, we started late.
Yes, we started a bit late. I used to have a microphone.
Oh, I gave away both of them.
Thank you. So that leaves us at least a few minutes of discussion. I would love to invite the audience to ask your questions, comment upon this fascinating lecture. Anyone would like, Friedrich? And perhaps we try to collect a few questions or comments and then.
Thank you very much. That was quite interesting, and I grew up quite near to that area. I'm also a big postcard collector, and I have quite a substantial collection of postcards from that time you were talking about. And on, I can say, 70 to 80% of the postcards from Germany of this time, it's exactly what you said. The people do not show the bigger history, they show the modernity of this time, connected to the places where they were living. So that was very, very typical, and it shows a lot about the time itself. One small anecdote from the beginning, you were talking about, has nothing to do with the last case studies. You were talking about this citation of America. Beware, the Hessians are coming.
Yes.
Actually, there's a turnaround. One of the first very famous hip-hop songs in Germany in the early 1980s is called Erbarmen die Hessen kommen. So this is where the American culture was brought back, just as a small...
And anyone would like to add another question?
Thank you for your presentation. I'm bad with names, so I forgot the cities' names. But
Yeah.
one of the cities you said they used the volcano stones
Yeah.
for their buildings. Was it like all of the samples were like that? They choose local materials?
Well, it was already said in several of the lectures. Yes, if possible, they tried to use local materials to make it more feasible, to make it cheaper, but also to create that sort of identity with the
Yes.
place. Yeah.
Because in one of your pictures, one of the buildings were fully stone, like fully made
Yeah.
out of stone, but it was in another city. So I wanted to know if that is local as well or not.
I mean, they couldn't use everything local because you don't have the proper building materials at every place. But as far as they could do it in that time, they tried to use local materials. Yeah.
So thank you. I particularly love the fact of completely ignoring part of the narratives and really choosing some of those for marketing strategies.
Yes.
This is really, really clever. My question is about the economy on which, this is because of my ignorance, the German refugees after the Second World War, on which economy were based, because the housing that you show were basically kind of part of a town.
Yeah.
So I suppose there was an idea behind building this kind of new towns. Was it an agricultural economy? It was more industrial one?
Well, in the very beginning, you just took what you could, because you have to understand there were 13 million refugees, 1945, in the western part of Germany. So you just tried to cope, however you could. And then it started in about 1948. They really start to try to structure it, and to think about where can we put refugees, where can we build a new settlement, where is it feasible. They were thinking about agriculture, but already Adenauer was saying, okay, the future for Germany is not in agriculture, it's in industry and in technology. So we need to have more urban settlements, even if they are in the countryside, to have people who will become engineers and technicians, and not people who become farmers. So under Adenauer, he made a contract with Canada to send 50,000 young farmers from Eastern Germany to Canada, where they started to lock the forests and build new communities, because he said, I can't do anything with these people. They are only trained as farmers, and they just don't have so many farms to give to them. The country is simply not big enough. And what we need is not lots of farmers. What we need is technicians and people who work in the industry.
Yeah, thank you. My question is, at the second part we heard about 20th century settlements, which actually were urban settlements,
Yes.
so they were contributing to the urban environment.
Or suburban, yeah.
Yeah, suburban, sleeping towns.
Yeah.
But I was fascinated by the 18th century Hessian example, which is a proper, like a medieval clearing,
Yes.
as I can see. Are there examples like that, or is it just one exceptional case? And my other question, actually, what happened in the 19th century? Was there anything in between these two peaks?
Actually, we have earlier examples really going back to the medieval period. The one in 1765 is the youngest one we have a documentation about. So maybe we may stumble about something younger in between, but between that in 1765 and the new settlement structures which were coming out more of the cities in the early 20th century, we are missing that. And this is, of course, because in that time we have the period of poverty. So the traditional industries collapsed, which were built on wood and water, and you have the industrialization, which is built on coal, and we don't have the coal in the Spessart. So basically, the old economy collapsed. What we have is people emigrating from the area, not immigrating into the area, and to find some strategies for those people who were still there to survive, which became better when the railway was invented, and then along the railway line, new production lines could be established. So there was not really, I think, the need for that sort of colonization in the 19th century. Yeah.
So we're running a little late, but if Simon will allow, I would like to ask Gerhard one last question, which is also related to the reason why we invited you as a keynote speaker. We had one keynote speaker on Monday elaborating on planning theories and on decentralization and the relationship between the metropolis and the countryside in 20th century thinking about how landscapes and territories should be organized. We had a second keynote speaker elaborating on architectural heritage, on architectural history, on the built evidence of rurality throughout modernism, and a third keynote speaker who, while not being specifically focused on a topic directly related to our research project or the conference, yet comes from yet another discipline, that is the discipline of archaeology, and mostly has developed a long-run project where the transfer and interaction of knowledge produced by the scholar to a large civil audience is at the center of your work and concern. Now, this is, I'd like you to try to elaborate on that, and I'd be more specific. The stories you told us about showed us that what you've been doing there is a deep history of the landscape, trying to pull out its anthropological depth. And all of the stories that you told us about, they carry different values, which are positive values, which talk about living together, acknowledging the past, looking towards the future, and mainly deconstructing nationalist and exclusivist narratives. And this I found exceptionally stimulating. Yet again, I was wondering, but who is the one elaborating these values, and where do they come from? And at a certain point you told us, talking about the high-rise building, that what you did as a start was asking the citizens that you want to work with what they would like to think and talk about. So my question basically is, when you engage as a scholar in citizen science, and from your experience, how does the balance work between your role as a scholar and your own research and cultural agenda and that of the people in front of you? And I guess that the more the people in front of you are capable of interacting at a certain level of reflexivity and on elaborating on their own history and have already been freed by their own nationalist narratives and so on, the easier it gets. But not always this might be the case.
Yes. So, well, actually what happens is that it's not that we come and say we want to make a cultural path or a thematic trail at a specific place, but it's always people coming to us and say we would like to have in our village, in our market town, we would have to have one of these cultural passes. And then the first thing is that we talk with these people who come to us, we talk with the mayor and council of that village, how we could organize it, and then we invite everybody to contribute in the working group, which normally takes 2 to 3 years to create one of these passes. Now, of course, a lot of passes are created parallel, but every single one is 2 or 3 years running until it is opened. So what happens is that the first thing is that we explain to people that everything they know matters, because what is normally the case, if you ask them what do you know about your village or your history, they say not really anything. Yeah? They say nothing, because they have a lot of knowledge, but they do not recognize that as a valuable knowledge. So the first thing is that we have to empower them to realize what we know is important. That takes 1 or 2, maximum 3 of the meetings, and then it starts to power out of them. And they come up with stories and bring up material, and after the 4th, 5th meeting, you have a huge amount of material on the table. So our job then is to sift that a little bit, to organize it, to make sure that we have now about 100 cultural passes in the region, that they are not telling all the same story, because that would be boring for everybody who wants to walk. And there are people who really try to walk every one of them. The second thing is that together with them, we structure it into a path which is really walkable. That again is a challenge. And in all that process, again and again, we ask them, what are the stories you want to tell? Well, sometimes, of course, we are so fascinated by some stories that they realize we find that story so interesting that they think, okay, then we have to put it in the past. We didn't think it was interesting, but if these guys think it's so interesting, then maybe we should have it in the past. But basically, it's what they want to communicate. Then the next step is you get told stories, and you have, of course, to verify them, to a certain extent at least. So that is the research project in the background. What we do with the students, where we put students on it to check things, but also where we use other citizen scientists to see, okay, can you go a little bit deeper there into the documents and see if that is feasible, what we got told. Now, if we find that some stories are not really feasible, it doesn't mean that we completely exclude them. It just means that we have to put them in context. So that is the story told in the village about a certain event. It's not necessarily the story which we can verify in the sources, but that is the story which is told in the village, for what reasons ever. Yeah? And then it might be interesting to find out why is that story so different from what we find from the sources. And there often is a reason for that. Something you want to tell or you do not want to tell. And of course, we want to be true to ourselves. So for example, one of the very first one, Letgenbrunn, about this village which has been destroyed 3 times, and which has been a military training ground in the First World War and in the Second World War. The next part of that area, the village, wanted to have a cultural path as well. And that is the part where we had also the Russian camp of prisoners in the Second World War, where thousands of them were killed. There is a cemetery about that. There is the Spessart High Street, which is now a touristic street, but it was built by Hindenburg for the military. It was then called the Hindenburg Street. And of course, we wanted to tell those stories. And then they said, no, we don't want to tell that story. We don't want to tell about the Russian prisoners of war. We don't want to talk about the war crimes. We don't want to talk about the cemetery. We don't want to talk about Hindenburg. And at a certain point, we said, okay, if you just want to have the cream and not the cake, then we as researchers cannot be part of that, because that would be lying. Yeah? We cannot tell just one side of the story and leave out the other story completely. Yeah? And if you cannot accept that, okay, we can understand that you don't want it, but we as researchers, we cannot be part of that. Yeah? So then we turned down and said, okay, that is a cultural path we cannot do. So that is also something, of course, which can happen. Yeah. But basically, in more than 90% of the cases, people are really proud and they want to tell the stories. And even if the stories are not the nicest one, and if they are problematic, you can find solutions normally with them to say, okay, that's a way we can present that.
Thank you. I think it was worth hearing these few words in addition. I suggest that we grant an applause to Gerhard Ermischer.